What if I told you that many strategic analysts now view Russia's invasion of Ukraine as the opening chapter of a conflict that could sweep the globe? Military strategists and geopolitical experts are pointing to this war as part of a broader pattern of escalating tensions across multiple continents. 5 critical regions are now creating unprecedented risks for global conflict: the Taiwan Strait, Ukraine's borders, the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, and Africa's Sahel region. Each location represents a potential flashpoint where a single miscalculation, like an accidental shootdown over the Taiwan Strait, could trigger a chain reaction involving every major world power. The question isn't whether these tensions exist, but how they compare to the global crises we faced before. From nuclear standoff to multi-front crisis. To understand the shift, consider how different today's crisis landscape looks from history's most dangerous moment. In 1962, clear U.S.-Soviet channels and MAD doctrine averted disaster during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, no single communication line prevents errors across 5 simultaneous flashpoints, where different leaders operate under conflicting nuclear doctrines. The Cold War created a binary threat model that, despite its dangers, offered predictability. 2 superpowers maintained clear red lines and established communication channels that prevented miscalculation during critical moments. The current geopolitical landscape has fractured this simple model into 5 distinct powder kegs, each with different players, stakes, and escalation triggers. Today's reality presents a fundamentally different challenge. Xi Jinping, Putin, Biden, and regional powers operate with conflicting objectives across multiple theaters simultaneously. Unlike the bilateral communication of 1962, current diplomatic channels involve dozens of state and non-state actors with varying degrees of rational decision-making processes. The clear hierarchy of Cold War alliances has given way to fluid partnerships that shift based on specific regional interests. Nuclear doctrine has evolved from mutually assured destruction to tactical nuclear weapons and threshold strategies that lower the bar for first use. Russia's nuclear doctrine now includes scenarios for tactical nuclear deployment in conventional conflicts, with Russian leaders making statements that imply nuclear use if Western arms cross certain red lines. China's expanding nuclear arsenal operates under different strategic assumptions than Soviet-era policies. North Korea's nuclear program follows unpredictable escalation patterns that don't conform to traditional deterrence theory. War games show that juggling Taiwan, Ukraine, South China Sea, Korea, and Africa at once stretches any leader's decision-making to the breaking point. Consider the complexity facing current decision-makers. A Taiwan crisis could trigger Japanese involvement through constitutional obligations, while simultaneously affecting South Korean security calculations regarding North Korea. Ukrainian conflict escalation might draw NATO resources away from Pacific deterrence, creating opportunities for Chinese action in the South China Sea. Expert analysis from defense think tanks shows how multiple simultaneous crises create decision-making pressure that increases miscalculation risks exponentially. When leaders must process threats from 5 regions simultaneously, the cognitive load overwhelms traditional diplomatic response mechanisms. Each crisis demands immediate attention while interacting with others in unpredictable ways. The interconnected nature of modern economies means that regional conflicts immediately affect global systems. Supply chain disruptions, energy market volatility, and financial system stress create economic warfare that parallels military escalation. When multiple regions experience simultaneous crises, the cumulative effect exceeds the sum of individual conflicts. This new threat environment requires examining each flashpoint's specific escalation potential. The most critical involves a narrow stretch of water, where global technology production and military rivalry create the perfect conditions for worldwide conflict. The semiconductor choke point that could sink the world economy. Every smartphone, computer, and military system depends on chips made in a 100-mile stretch of water that Beijing views as a renegade province to be reunified by force if necessary, while the U.S. has pledged to defend with military force. The Taiwan Strait represents the world's most economically critical potential battlefield, where TSMC controls over half of the world's chip foundry market and virtually all of the most advanced 5-nanometer-plus nodes. Concentrated on Taiwan, this geographic concentration creates a vulnerability that no modern economy can survive without. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company holds an unparalleled position in global technology infrastructure. TSMC produces cutting-edge processors for Apple, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, and virtually every major tech company worldwide. The company's fabrication facilities manufacture the most advanced chips available, with production processes that other nations have struggled to replicate despite massive investment efforts. China has deployed over 2,000 missiles aimed at Taiwan, creating the capability to devastate the island's infrastructure within hours of conflict initiation. Chinese amphibious assault capabilities have expanded dramatically, with new landing craft and specialized military units trained specifically for cross-strait operations. The U.S. 7th Fleet patrols nearby waters as a deterrent, maintaining carrier strike groups and forward-deployed assets throughout the Pacific. Beijing's claim to Taiwan dates to 1949, when the Republic of China government retreated to the island following the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. Xi Jinping has made reunification a cornerstone of his political legacy, stating publicly that the Taiwan question cannot be passed down from generation to generation. This commitment contrasts sharply with Taiwan's democratic government and the island's 23 million residents who have developed a distinct political identity over 7 decades. The military mathematics create automatic escalation mechanisms that extend far beyond the immediate participants. Japan's constitutional obligations would activate defense partnerships if conflict affects Japanese territory. Australia's defense commitments and South Korea's strategic calculations would draw these nations into the conflict within 72 hours, according to classified wargame scenarios. A Chinese blockade of Taiwan's ports would immediately disrupt global supply chains and force U.S. military response to maintain international shipping access, turning a local crisis global. U.S. freedom of navigation operations could prompt Chinese military reaction if perceived as direct provocation. Accidental collisions between military vessels in increasingly crowded waters could escalate beyond diplomatic control given the high-stakes environment. Wargame results consistently demonstrate how Taiwan conflict expands globally within days rather than weeks. Regional powers cannot remain neutral when semiconductor production faces disruption. NATO allies become involved through economic necessity rather than formal treaty obligations. The interconnected nature of modern technology means that chip production disruption affects military systems, communications infrastructure, and economic stability across every continent. Taiwan represents the only location where economic interdependence and military rivalry create conditions where local conflict automatically becomes global war. No major power can afford to lose access to semiconductor production, making neutrality impossible when survival of technological civilization depends on factories located in an active war zone. This convergence of economic dependency and military competition transforms a regional dispute into a global crisis that forces every nation to choose sides based on technological survival rather than political preference. This same pattern of forced alliance formation is already reshaping the global strategic landscape through a conflict that, many experts argue, has fundamentally altered how nations approach international security. The European war that's already reshaping global alliances. Ukraine has triggered the biggest European war since 1945, redrawing strategic lines across continents. The scale of military engagement extends far beyond regional boundaries, involving direct weapons transfers, intelligence sharing, and economic warfare that affects nations from the Arctic to Africa. This represents a fundamental shift from localized territorial disputes to global strategic competition. Over 50 countries now provide military aid to Ukraine, creating the most extensive military support network since World War II. This assistance includes advanced weaponry, intelligence capabilities, training programs, and logistical support that transforms Ukraine's military capacity. Meanwhile, Russia receives weapons from North Korea, Iran, and China in what military analysts recognize as a clear axis formation. Russia has threatened nuclear retaliation if Western weapons strike Russian territory, establishing red lines that test NATO's willingness to escalate support while maintaining plausible deniability about direct military engagement. The conflict demonstrates how contemporary warfare operates across multiple domains simultaneously. Russia's wiper malware attacks on Ukrainian networks have crippled power grids, banking systems, and government communications, showing how digital warfare amplifies kinetic battles. These cyber operations extend beyond Ukraine's borders, targeting Western infrastructure and creating vulnerabilities that affect civilian populations across Europe. The conflict has expanded beyond Ukraine's borders through NATO weapons supplies, Russian attacks on Western infrastructure, and military buildups from Finland to Romania. European nations have repositioned military assets, increased defense spending, and activated reserve forces at levels not seen since the Cold War. Critical infrastructure attacks on undersea cables, power grids, and communication networks have occurred across multiple European countries, indicating that the operational theater extends throughout the continent. Economic warfare affects global stability through Russian energy cutoffs to Europe, which triggered a surge in global gas prices and forced nations to restructure energy relationships built over decades. This weaponization of energy supplies parallels Cold War-era trade manipulation, where economic tools become weapons, affecting civilian populations thousands of miles from active combat zones. The conflict triggered Finland and Sweden's NATO membership applications, militarized Arctic shipping lanes, and forced previously neutral countries to choose sides in ways that mirror 1930s alliance formation patterns. Switzerland, Austria, and other traditionally neutral nations have imposed sanctions and provided military equipment, abandoning decades of non-alignment policies. These alliance shifts create new strategic calculations that extend the conflict's influence across multiple continents. Intelligence assessments reveal Russian military preparations for potential conflict with NATO members, while Western forces develop Article 5 response scenarios. Military exercises on both sides now simulate direct confrontation between nuclear powers, creating hair-trigger conditions where miscalculation could trigger automatic alliance responses. Ukraine represents the transition from post-Cold War stability to active great power competition, where proxy conflicts serve as testing grounds for direct military confrontation between nuclear powers. This pattern of forced alliance formation is simultaneously playing out in waters where economic necessity and territorial ambition create even more dangerous conditions for global conflict. The maritime battleground where global trade meets military ambition. Trillions in global trade passes through the South China Sea annually, but China's artificial island fortresses and U.S. Navy patrols have turned the world's busiest shipping lane into a potential naval battlefield. This waterway serves as the intersection of economic necessity and territorial ambition, where 6 countries claim overlapping territory and 2 superpowers project military power through increasingly sophisticated naval operations. China has constructed artificial islands throughout disputed waters, transforming submerged reefs into military installations equipped with runways, missile systems, and radar facilities capable of monitoring and controlling shipping routes used by Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asian economies. These fortified positions provide China with unprecedented ability to project power across vital maritime corridors that connect major economic centers throughout the Pacific region. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei maintain competing territorial claims backed by different external powers and international legal rulings that China refuses to recognize. the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled against China's expansive territorial claims in 2016, but Beijing rejected the decision and continued military construction activities. These overlapping jurisdictional disputes create multiple potential flashpoints where local incidents could escalate into broader conflicts. Military escalation patterns demonstrate increasing aggression across multiple domains. Chinese Coast Guard vessels regularly ram Philippine ships conducting resupply missions to disputed outposts. U.S. freedom of navigation operations challenge Chinese territorial assertions through regular naval patrols that traverse contested waters. These recurring confrontations create conditions where miscalculation becomes increasingly likely, as military assets from multiple nations operate in increasingly crowded waters. What does this mean for international governance? Wargame simulations show a single incident in the South China Sea can escalate within days, drawing in Japan and Australia under security partnerships. A collision between Chinese and U.S. naval vessels could trigger automatic alliance responses given the military assets both nations maintain in the region. China's closure of shipping lanes during a Taiwan crisis would immediately disrupt global supply chains and force neutral nations to choose sides based on economic survival rather than political preference. Military action to enforce territorial claims against Southeast Asian countries would activate defense partnerships and mutual assistance agreements that extend beyond the immediate region. ASEAN nations maintain various security relationships with the United States, Australia, and Japan that could transform local territorial disputes into multilateral military confrontations within hours of initial conflict. Here's why this strategic framework matters. Conflict in the South China Sea would immediately affect global supply chains, energy prices, and force countries worldwide to choose between economic relationships with China and security partnerships with the U.S. The South China Sea represents the perfect storm of economic dependency and military competition, where any attempt to control vital shipping lanes through force would immediately globalize the conflict by threatening the economic survival of nations on every continent. This convergence of economic vulnerability and military competition creates conditions where multiple regional flashpoints could activate simultaneously, overwhelming the diplomatic mechanisms designed to prevent such escalation. Conclusion: WW3 may not start with a formal declaration, but with multiple flashpoints igniting before leaders can defuse them. We need to monitor Taiwan, Ukraine, South China Sea, Korea, and the Sahel not as separate news stories, but as interconnected elements of a global crisis that could reshape civilization within months. Unlike previous world wars that built up over years, research shows that modern economic interdependence and rapid military deployment capabilities mean regional conflicts can spiral into worldwide catastrophe within days. The interconnected nature of global supply chains, financial systems, and alliance structures creates automatic escalation mechanisms that overwhelm traditional diplomatic solutions. Which flashpoint worries you most? Let me know in the comments below, and subscribe for deeper analysis of each region as these critical situations continue to develop.